In this video, I'd like to give you a brief overview of my prototype game Aliksir. Aliksir is a strategic, single-player, turn-based deck-building card battler, where one round takes around 20 to 30 minutes to play, and the game is going to appeal to players of games like Inscription, Hearthstone, Legends of Runeterra. The target age group is 13+. So, it is my turn. These are my hand cards. I have 2 mana granted to me by this recipe. This recipe also requires 2 sulfur, 1 mercury, 1 salt and an alchemist to transform it into a strong silver creature. I have a card in my laboratory that will help me generate the resources needed. So I'll explain how the laboratory works. The laboratory is a zone that has 3 steps. When you play a card into the laboratory, you can only play it into step 1. And if there's already a card there, it will be pushed into the next step, and so on. And only when it exits, like it says on the card, will you get its promised effect. So in this case, I want to get the resources required for the recipe as soon as possible. So I have this card here that, when played, says I have to discard a recipe and then I can generate, and this is exactly what we want. So I have this recipe here, I'll discard it, and for that I'll generate. So I'll get one of each resource. These resources are still theoretical. We don't actually have them. To actually produce them, we have to push them through the lab, like so. And now that this exits, like I said before, this will also generate. So I get even more of these cards into my hand. I can play another sulfur, and since this now has exited the laboratory, I will get 1 sulfur, and so on. Now I'll get 1 salt, and now I'll get 1 mercury. My enemy would play their turn, and then it would be my turn again. I'll draw a card. We're still missing an alchemist and 1 sulfur, but as we can see, the sulfur is the next thing up for exit. And we have a spell that can also travel through the laboratory. When it enters the laboratory, we can draw a card, and when it exits, we can draw 2 cards. So we'll play this. We'll play it into step 1. We push the things out. We get 1 sulfur, and we can draw a card. Okay. And now we drew an alchemist, but we cannot play it because we're lacking the mana. But what we can do is we can move this alchemist from the battlefield into this zone here. And now we have everything for this recipe. So now what we'll do, these resources that are needed, we'll discard this alchemist because we use it to research this recipe, and then we can move it into the lab, and this will happen. And to really transform this card into the creature, it has to move through the laboratory like these materials did. Only then will it transform into the actual card, and hopefully win us the game, because it is way stronger than these other enemy units. So as we've seen, there are many types of cards that can travel through the laboratory. There are resource cards, there are procedures, spells that can be played into the lab. There are also units that can be played into the lab if they have the lab symbol. Recipes that were researched can also travel through the lab, and once they exit, they transform. And we have a final type of card, contamination. In this example, the enemy attacks our unit, and our unit dies in combat. We would suffer a contamination into this zone. Once it is our turn, at the end of the turn, this contamination will also by force move into the laboratory and travel through these steps like any other element we've seen. And once it exits, it will take a life point from us. The stronger the enemy creatures, the more contamination we will suffer. And there are cards that we can play to remove contamination, but sometimes we want to use contamination to drive forward the progress of our laboratory. And so eventually we'll take 3 damage, but also our lab progress has advanced considerably, and maybe this will give us an advantage against our opponent.